Book 1, Chapter 4 of Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Strangers and Pilgrims, Book 1, Chapter 4. O you gods, why do you make us love your goodly gifts and snatch them straight away? We here below recall not what we give, and therein may vie honour with yourselves. A perfect lull in the summer winds, a sultry silence in the air. Tabor lying stilly under the beeches, dark and polished as a mirror of Damascus steel, not a bulrush on its margent, not a lily trembling on its bosom. There seemed almost a profanity in happy talk and laughter in that silent wood, where the great beeches that were crop-eared by Cromwell spread their gnarled limbs under the hot blue sky. Mr. Luttrell's party, however, do not pause in their mirth to consider the fitness of things. It boots not them to ask whether Lawborough beeches be not a scene more suited to Miltonic musings than to the consumption of lobster salad and galantine de veau. They ask each other for salt and bread and bitter ale, while the lark pierces the topmost heavens with purest melody. They set champagne corks flying against the giant beechen trunks. They revel in clotted cream and syllabub, and small talk and flirtation amid the solemn shadows of that leafy dell. And then, when they have spent nearly 2 hours in a business-like absorption of solids and fluids, or in playing trifling with the lightest of the viands, as the case may be, the picnickers abandon the scene of the banquet and wander away in little clusters of 3 or 4, or in solitary couples, dispersing themselves throughout the wood, nay, even beyond, to a broad stretch of rugged heath that borders it on one side, or to the slope of a hill which shelters it on the other. Some tempt the dangers of smooth-faced Tabor in Fred Melvin's trim-built wherry, or in the punt which has conveyed a brace of Oxonians, James and Horace Elgood, the sons of one of the squires whose broad pastures border the town of Hawley. Mr. Melvin has been anxious that Elizabeth should trust herself upon that silver flood. "You know you're fond of boating," he pleads, "and if you haven't seen much of the Tabor this way, it's worth your while to come. The banks are a picture, no end of flowers. I know a bank whereon the wild thyme grows, and that kind of thing. One would think Shakespeare had taken his notion from hereabouts." "As if the Avon had no thymy banks," exclaimed Elizabeth contemptuously. "I don't care about boating this afternoon, thank you, Mr. Melvin. I'm going for a walk." She glanced at Malcolm Forde as she spoke, almost pleadingly, as if she would have said, "Give me one idle hour of your life." They had sat apart at the banquet, Gertrude having contrived to keep the curate at her side. They had travelled from Hawley in different carriages, and had exchanged hardly half a dozen sentences up to this stage of the entertainment. It seemed to Elizabeth as if they were fated never to be together. Already she began to think the picnic a failure. "I only wanted it for the sake of being with him," she said to herself hopelessly. And here was that empty-headed Fred Melvin worrying her to go in his boat, while Malcolm Forde stood by, leaning against the grey trunk of a pollard willow, listlessly gazing at the river, and said never a word. "Let Forde punt you down the river as far as the Weir," cried one of the Oxonians, coming unconsciously to her relief. "There's an empty punt lying idle yonder, the one that brought the Towers party. And Forde was one of the best punters at Oxford." Mr. Forde had gone up to his degree at a late stage of his existence, after he left the army, and his repute was known to these youngsters. "There's nothing like a punt in this kind of weather, Miss Luttrell," said the Oxonian, as he rolled up his shirt-sleeves and prepared himself to convey a boatload of young ladies in voluminous muslin skirts. "Such a nice lazy way of getting along." He stood up high above his freight, plunged his pole deep into the quiet water, and skimmed athwart the river with a slow, noiseless motion, soothing to see upon a summer afternoon, while Elizabeth was silently blessing him. Mr. Forde did at last awake from his reverie. Shall I get the punt?" he asked. "And will you come?" "I should like it of all things," she answered gently. She was not going to hazard the loss of this perfect happiness by any ill-timed coquetry. Yes, it was perfect happiness to be with him. She acknowledged as much as that to herself, if she did not acknowledge any more. "I suppose I think so much of him simply because he thinks nothing of me," she said to herself musingly, while Mr. Forde had gone a little way down the bank to fetch the punt. He came back presently, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up like the Oxonian's, skilfully navigating his rude bark with lengthy vigorous arms that had pulled in the University 8. It was the first time that Elizabeth had seen him on the river, and she wondered a little to find him master of this secular accomplishment. He brought the broad stem of the punt against the bank at her feet. "Wouldn't your sister Blanche like to go with us?" he asked, looking round in quest of that young lady. But Blanche had gone off in the wherry with the Melvin set, Miss Pooley, the doctor's daughter, the Miss Cumdens, the rich manufacturer's daughters, Captain Danvers, and Mr. Pynsent. Shrill laughter sounded from the reedy shores beyond the sharp curve of the river. Even James Elgood's punt was out of sight. They had the river all to themselves. Utter loneliness seemed to have come upon the scene. The sound of that shrill laughter dwindled and died away, and these two stood alone in the sweet summer silence, between sunlight and shadow, on the brink of the deep, still Tabor. Elizabeth lingered on the bank, doubtful whether it would not be the properer course to wait for some stray reveller to join them before she took her place in the boat. A tete-a-tete excursion with Mr. Forde would entail sundry lectures from Gertrude, a general sense of disapproval perhaps in her small world. But Malcolm Forde stretched out his strong arm and calmly handed her into the punt. It was quite a luxurious kind of boat, as punts go, provided with a red cushion on one of the broad clumsy seats, and a tin vessel for bailing out unnecessary water. She seated herself in the stern, and they drifted away slowly, softly, over the still blue water. It was the first time they had been together and alone since the morning when she called upon him at his lodgings. For some time there was silence, sweet silence, only broken by the hum of insect life around them and the skylark's song in the clear vault above. The navigation of a punt is not a very difficult business, but it requires some attention, and Tabor's windings involved some small amount of care in the navigation. This made a fair excuse for Mr. Forde's silence, and Elizabeth was content to watch the dark thoughtful face, the firmly cut profile, the deep grey eyes, grave almost to severity, content to ponder on his life, wondering if it were hard work and careful thought for others that had blanched the ruddier tints from his somewhat sunken cheek, or whether he was by nature pale, wondering if that grave dignity, which made him different from the common race of curates, were in earnest of future eminence, if he were verily born to greatness and a bishopric awaiting him in the days to come, wondering idly about this thing and that, her fancies playing round him like the flickering shadows on his figure as the boat shot under the trees, and she supremely content to be in his company. Perhaps, since she had more than all a woman's faults and weaknesses, it may have been some gratification to her to consider that this boating excursion would occasion some jealous twinges in the well-ordered mind of her eldest sister. "Gertrude has such a way of appropriating people," she said to herself, "and I really believe Mr. Forde considers her a paragon." The navigation grew easier by and by, as Tabor became less weedy. The banks, now high and broken, now sloping gently, were rich in varying beauty. But it was not of wild flowers or shivering rushes that Elizabeth thought in that slow summer voyage. The banks slid by like pictures gently shifting as she looked, now a herd of lazy kine fetlock deep in the odorous aftermath, and then a little copse of ancient hawthorn, and then a silvery creek, darkly shadowed here and there by drooping willows that had grown aslant the stream. She was faintly conscious of these things, and felt a vague delight in them, but her thoughts were all of Malcolm Forde. "Did you ever hear that story of Andrew Marvell's father?" he said at last, breaking that lazy silence which had seemed only a natural element of the warm summer afternoon. There was a straight stretch of water now before him, so he laid down his pole and seated himself in the bows with a pair of sculls. He was a Hull man, you know, and a clergyman, and he was going across the Humber to marry a couple in Lincolnshire. He was seized with a strange presentiment on stepping into the boat, and flung his walking-stick ashore, crying, "Ho, for heaven!" The presage was not a false one, for old Marvell was drowned. The story came into my mind just now when we left the bank, and I couldn't help feeling that it would be a pleasant way of solving the problem of life to shoot midstream at random, crying out, "Ho, for heaven!" like that old Puritan parson. "It would be very nice if heaven could be reached so easily," said Elizabeth, who had a feeling that for her the pilgrimage from this world to a better one must needs be difficult. She had never yet felt herself heavenly minded, of the earth, earthy rather, with mundane longings for an opera box and a barouche and pair. "But I did not think you were tired of life, Mr. Forde," she added after a little pause. "Not exactly tired, but at times perplexed. I sometimes doubt whether I am doing much good in Hawleigh, whether indeed I am doing anything that a man of less energy and ambition might not do just as well." "You feel like an eagle doing the work of a crow," she answered, smiling. "I can fancy that Hawleigh must seem a narrow field for you. When you've persuaded people to decorate the churches and attend the early services, and taught the choir to sing a little better, and bought surplices for the boys, it seems as if there was nothing left for you to do. I should think in a populous seaport now, where there are narrow streets and a great many wicked people, you would have a wider sphere." "There might be more to do in a place of that kind," he said thoughtfully. "It wouldn't seem quite so much like a gardener's work in a trim, smooth garden, always going over the same flower beds, dragging up a little weed here and there, or cutting a withered branch. But that is not my dream. The field of action that I have thought about and longed for lies far away from England." He was looking not at Elizabeth, but above her head, along the shining river, as if he did indeed with his bodily eyes behold that wider land, that distant world of which he spoke. Elizabeth grew pale with horror. "You surely don't mean that you have ever thought of turning missionary?" she exclaimed. "That has been my thought sometimes, when my work here has seemed wasted labour." She was inexpressibly shocked. The very idea was disagreeable to her. There was even a kind of commonness in her mind in the image of a missionary. She imagined him a low church person, not very far removed from a dissenter, a man who let his hair grow long, and was indifferent as to the fashion of his garments, such a man as she had heard hold forth in short trousers and thick boots at a meeting for the propagation of the gospel. She did not imagine that the commonness was in her own mind, which could not perceive the width and grandeur in that sublime idea of gathering all the nations into one flock. It had never occurred to her that South Sea Islanders were of any importance in the scheme of creation, that university men in this privileged quarter of the globe owed any duty to dusky heathens dancing strange dances in distant groves of palm and breadfruit trees under a hot blue sky. "Oh, I hope you'll never think of such a desperate thing," she said with a little piteous look that touched him strangely. "It seems a kind of moral suicide." "Say rather a second birth," he answered. "The beginning of a new and wider life, a life worth living." You must care very little for anyone on this side of the world, when you can talk so calmly of going to the other." "I have very few to care for," he replied gravely. "My family ties are represented by a bachelor uncle in Aberdeenshire, a grim old man who farms a wild sheep walk of 5,000 acres or so, and lives in a lonely homestead where he hears few sounds except the lowing of his kine and the roar of the German Ocean. I think I'm just the right kind of man for a missionary, and if you knew the story of my life, and the circumstance that led to my change of profession, I fancy you would agree with me." "But I know nothing of your life," Elizabeth cried impatiently. She was unreasonably angry with him for this missionary project, almost as angry as if it had been a deliberate wrong done to herself. "You came to us a stranger, and you have remained a stranger to us, though you have been at Hawleigh more than a year. You are so reserved, not like papa's other curates, who are only too glad to pour out their inmost feelings, as it were. I'm sure I knew every detail of Mr. Dysart's family, his papa's opinion, his mamma's little peculiarities, the colour of all his sisters' hair, even the history of the gentleman to whom the sisters were engaged. And it was almost the same with Mr. Horton. Mr. Adderley was fonder of prosing about himself than his surroundings, and I don't think the poor young man ever had an idea in his rather narrow brain that he did not impart to us." "You see, I am not of so communicative a disposition," said Mr. Forde, smiling. "And when there has been one great sorrow in a life, as there has in mine, it is apt to assume an unnatural proportion to the rest, and obscure all minor details. I had a great loss 5 years before I came to Hawleigh. I have often been inclined to tell you all about it, especially of late, since I have seen your character in its most amiable light. But these things are painful to speak of, and my loss was a very bitter one." "You are speaking of the death of your mother?" inquired Elizabeth, trembling a little, with a strange sharp dread. "Oh, no, no. My mother died 15 years ago. That loss was bitter, but it was one for which I had been long prepared. The latter loss was utterly unexpected, and shattered the very fabric of my life." "I should like to hear about it," said Elizabeth, her face bent over the water, one idle hand drawn loosely through the tide. "I am assured that you are kind and sympathetic," he said, "or I should never have touched upon this subject. I never had a sister, and perhaps on that account have not acquired the habit of confession. But," very slowly and with a curious hesitation, "I think I should like to talk to you about her, about Alice Fraser, the woman who was to have been my wife." The face bent over the river flushed crimson, the little white hand shivered in the tide, but Elizabeth spoke no word. "When I went to India with my regiment, it was just after the mutiny, I left my promised wife behind me. We were old friends, had been playfellows even, though the little Scottish lassie was 7 years younger than I. She was the daughter of a Scotch parson, a man of noble mind and widest reading, and the best friend and counsellor I ever had. I will not try to tell you what she was like. To me she seemed perfection, pretty enough to be charming, full of brightness and vivacity, yet with a depth and earnestness in her nature that made me, her senior by 7 years, feel that here was a staff to lean upon through all the journey of life. I cannot tell you how I revered this girl of 19. You will perhaps think that she was self-opinionated, or what people call strong-minded, but there was never a more simple, unassuming nature. She had been educated by her father, and on a wider plan than the common scheme of a woman's teaching. Of late years she had shared his studies, and had been his chosen companion in every hour of leisure. Of her goodness to the people round about her I cannot trust myself to speak. Her memory is cherished in Glenorchy as the memory of a saint. I doubt if, among all who knew her well in that simple flock, there is one who could speak of her even now without tears." He paused for some few minutes, perhaps lost in thought, recalling that remote Scottish village and the sweet girlish face that had been the delight of his life 6 years ago. The oars dipped gently in the river, the boat glided on with imperceptible motion, and Elizabeth sat silent, with her face still bent over the water, dragging the long green river weeds through her cold white fingers. She had the very slightest Scottish accent, an accent that gave a plaintive tone to her voice, like music in a minor key. She was slender and fragile, just about the middle height, very fair but very pale, with soft brown hair, the sort of woman a painter would choose for Imogen or Ophelia. Not an objective nature, strongly marked with its own individuality. Subjective, rather, yet strong enough to resist all evil. A bad husband might have broken her heart, but he would never have sullied her mind. He stopped again, laid down his sculls, and drew the boat under the reedy bank. Elizabeth was obliged to look up now. The little grey straw hat, with its convenient shadow, hid the change in her face in some measure, but not entirely, for Mr. Forde observed that she was very pale. " I fear you're tired," he said, " or that my dreary talk has wearied you." " Oh, no, no. Go on. She must have been very good." " She had less of humanity's alloy than any creature I ever knew," he answered. "I used to think that it would be a privilege for any man, the best even, to spend his life in her company. There was one subject that gave her great pain, and that was the fact of my profession. To her gentle spirit there was something horrible in a soldier's career. She could not see the nobler side of my calling. And I loved her too well to hold by anything that gave her pain. I promised her that I would sell out immediately on my return from foreign service, and I kept my word." " It was not of your own accord, then, that you left the army ?" asked Elizabeth absently, as if only half her brain were following his words. " Oh, no. It was entirely to please Alice. I sacrificed my own inclinations in the matter. That conviction which has become the very keystone of my life since then is a faith that grew out of my great sorrow. I cannot tell you the rest of the story too briefly. I went back to Glenorchy a free man. I was to be a farmer, a country gentleman on a small scale, anything Alice pleased in the district where I was born. My sweet girl was to live for ever among the people she loved. Our life was to be Arcadian, a pastoral poem. We were both very happy. I can safely declare that there was not left in my mind one spark of mankind's common desire of success or distinction. The long, calm years stretched themselves out before me in sweet, eventless happiness." " You must have loved her very much." " If you could measure my love by the change it made in me, you would have good reason to say so. I had been as eager as other young men for name, position, wealth, and pleasure, perhaps even more eager. But Alice's love filled my mind with a great content. She made herself the sun of my life. I desired nothing beyond the peaceful circle of the home that she and I were to share together. Well, Miss Luttrell," this with a sudden abruptness, as if the words were wrenched from him, "it was a common trouble enough when it came. Our wedding day was fixed. Her old father, every one, was happy. The last touch had been put to our new home, a house I had built for my darling upon a hillside facing the sea, on my own land. Everything was arranged. Our honeymoon trip southwards to the Cumberland Lakes had been planned between us on the map one sweet summer evening. We parted at her father's door, she a little graver than usual, but that seemed natural on the threshold of so great a change. When I went to the manse next morning, they told me that she was not quite well, that her father's old friend, the village doctor, recommended her to keep a room for a day or two, and to see no one. She had had a little too much excitement and fatigue lately. I reproached myself bitterly for our long walks on the hills and by the rugged seashore that we both loved so well. All she wanted was perfect rest. They kept me off like this for nearly a week, now confessing reluctantly that she was not quite so well, now cheering me with the assurance that she was better. Then one morning I heard that they had sent to Glasgow for a physician. After that I insisted upon seeing her. She did not know me. I stood beside her bed, and the sweet blue eyes looked up at me, but she was unconscious. The physician acknowledged that it was a case of typhoid fever. There was very little ground for hope. Yet we did hope, blindly, to the last. I telegraphed for other doctors, but we could not save her. She died in my arms at daybreak on the day that was to have seen us married. I will not speak of the dead blank that followed her death, of the miserable time in which I could think of nothing but the one fact of my loss. The time came at last when I could think of her more calmly, and then I set myself to consider what I could do, now that she was gone, to prove that I loved her, what tribute I could render to my dead. It was then I thought of entering the church, of devoting myself, so far as in me lay, to the good of others, of leading such a life as she would have blessed. That is the origin of all I have done, of all I hope to do. That is the end of my story, Miss Luttrell. I trust I have not tired you very much. I thought we should be better friends if you knew more about my past." "I am very glad," she answered gently. "I have sometimes fancied there must be something in your life, some sorrowful memory. Not that there's ever seemed anything gloomy in your character, but you are so much more in earnest, altogether so unlike papa's other curates." A faint blush lit up the pale face as she said this, remembering that he differed most widely from these gentlemen in his total inability to appreciate herself. Yes, she had fancied there was some bitter memory in his past, but not this. His confidence had strangely shocked her. It was inexpressibly painful to her to discover that his love, and so profound a love, had all been lavished upon another woman years ago, that were she, Elizabeth Luttrell, twice as lovely, twice as fascinating as she was, she could never be anything to him. He had chosen his type of womanly perfection. He had given away all the feeling, all the passion that it was in him to give, long before he had seen her face. "Did he suppose that I was beginning to think too much of him?" she said to herself, blushing indignantly, "and tell me this story by way of a warning? No, no, his manner was too straightforward for that. He thinks that I am good, thinks that I am able to sympathise with him, to pity him, to be sorry for that dead girl. And I am not. I think I am jealous of her in her grave." The boat glides softly on. They come to a curve in the river, and to Mr. Melvin's party returning noisily. "Oh, you're not going to take Miss Elizabeth any farther, are you?" cries Frederick. "We're going back to tea. How slow you've been. We went as far as the Bells, and had some shandygaff." Mr. Forde turned his clumsy bark, and all the voyage back was noisy with the talk of the Melvin party and the Oxonian's punt-load of vivacious humanity. They were all in holiday spirits, laughing on the faintest provocation, at the smallest imaginable jokes. Elizabeth thought it the most dismal business. All the sunshine was taken out of her afternoon. Tabor seemed a sullen stream flowing between flat, weedy banks. But she could not afford to let other people perceive her depression, Mr. Forde above all. She was obliged to affect amusement at these infinitesimal jokes, those stale witticisms, while she was thinking all the time of that thrice blessed woman whom Malcolm Forde had loved, and who had timely died while his passion was yet in its first bloom and freshness. I dare say if she had gone on living he would have been tired of her by this time, she said to herself in a cynical mood. She would have been his wife of ever so many years' standing, with a herd of small children perhaps on her mind, and just as commonplace as all the wives one knows, women whose intellects hardly soar above nursemaids and pinafores. How much better to be a sacred memory of his life than a prosaic fact in his everyday existence. After this, Elizabeth felt as if she could have no more pleasure in Malcolm Forde's society. Her selfish soul revolted against the idea that the memory of his dead was more to him than any favour her friendship could bestow, that she was divided from him by the width of a grave. I wish his Alice had lived, and he had stayed among his native hills with the rest of the Scotch barbarians, she said to herself. I don't think I've been quite happy since I've known him. He makes one feel such a contemptible creature, with his grand ideas of what a woman ought to be. And then, after one has tried one's hardest to be good against one's very nature, he coolly informs one that there never was but one perfect woman in the world, and that she lies among the Scottish hills, with his heart buried in her grave. End of chapter 4. Book 1, Chapter 5 of Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book 1, Chapter 5. Well, you must set down to me love that was life, life that was love, a tenure of breath that your lips decree, a passion to stand as your thoughts approve, a rapture to fall where your foot might be. The gypsy tea went off brilliantly. The fuel collecting and fire making and kettle boiling afforded ample sport for those wilder and more youthful spirits whose capacity for flirtation was not yet exhausted. Fred Melvin belonged to that harmless class of young men who, although in the dull round of daily life but moderately gifted, shine forth with unexpected lustre on such an occasion as this, and prove themselves what their friends call an acquisition. He fanned light and life into a hopelessly obstinate fire, with his straw hat for an extemporaneous bellows. He showed a profound knowledge of engineering in his method of placing the kettle on the burning logs, so as not immediately to extinguish the flames he had just coaxed into being. I don't think there was anything so very wonderful in Watt inventing the steam engine, said Miss Melvin, standing by and admiring her brother's dexterity. I believe Fred would have been quite as likely to hit upon it if it hadn't been done before his time. They drank tea in little scattered groups, the elders foregathering in small knots to talk scandal or parish business, or to indulge in mild jeremiads upon the frivolity and general empty-headedness of the rising generation, their own sons and daughters and nephews and nieces not excepted. The juniors to disport themselves after their kind with inexhaustible nothings, vapid utterances which filled the soul of Elizabeth with contempt. She carried her teacup away to a lonely little bit of bank, where the rushes on the shelving shore grew high enough to screen her from the rest of the company, and sat here alone, absorbed in languid contemplation of the quiet water and all the glories of the sunset reflected on that smooth tide. Fred Melvin, seeing the white dress vanishing beyond the trees, would fain have gone in pursuit, but the Luttrell sisters prevented him. "Elizabeth has one of her headaches, I daresay," said Diana. "It would be no use going after her." "One of her tempers, you mean, Di," exclaimed Blanche with sisterly candour. That's always the way with Lizzie if everything doesn't happen exactly as she wants it to happen. I think she would like a world made to order on purpose for her." "Oh, I hope we haven't done anything to offend her," cried the anxious Frederick, whose adoration of the beauty as chief goddess of his soul had never suffered diminution, not even when he amused himself by offering his homage at lesser shrines. "Perhaps she didn't like our going off in the boat without her, but it really couldn't have held so much as a lapdog beyond our load." "As if anything you could do would offend her!" exclaimed the impetuous Blanche, always ready to rebuke Mr. Melvin's vain passion. "Do you think she wanted to come in our boat? She would have given her ears for that tete-a-tete row with Mr. Forde, only I suppose it didn't answer." "Blanche, how can you be so absurd?" cried Gertrude. "If you don't learn to behave yourself with common decency, we really must leave you at home in the nursery another time," said Diana. Mr. Forde was happily beyond the hearing of this little explosion. He was in infinite request among the matrons of the party, who all regarded him more or less as a modern St. Francis de Sales, and who gave him not a little trouble by their insistence upon communicating small facts relating to their spiritual progress, little sentimental gushes of feeling, which he did his best to check, his ideas of duty being of the broadest and grandest character. He would rather have had the conversion of all the hardened or remorseful felons at Portland or Dartmoor on his hands than those gushing matrons and sentimental spinsters who could not travel the smallest stage of their journey toward the heavenly Jerusalem without being propped and sustained by him. Nor was it pleasant to listen to little laments about the vicar. "Oh, a kind, generous-minded man, Mr. Forde, and very good to the poor, I believe, in his own careless way, but so unspiritual. We hardly knew what light was till you came among us," and so on, and so on. He was glad to slip away from the elder tea-drinkers and stroll in and out among the giant beech bowls, with the gay sound of youthful laughter and happy idle talk filling the atmosphere around him. He lingered to say a few words to Gertrude Luttrell and her party, and then looked around the circle curiously, as if missing someone. "I don't see your sister," he said at last. "Miss Elizabeth." Miss Luttrell coloured furiously. "Lizzie has strayed off somewhere," she said. "She appears to prefer the company of her own thoughts to our society. Perhaps had she known you would express so much anxiety about her, she would have stayed." "Oh, I'm not particularly anxious," replied Mr. Forde, with his thoughtful smile, a smile which lent sudden life and brightness to the dark grave face. "Only I have it on my conscience that I kept your sister on the river a long while under a blazing sun, and I feared she might be too tired to enjoy herself with the rest of you. Can I take her a cup of tea?" "I don't think I would if I were you," cried Fred Melvin, who was in picturesque attitude, half kneeling, half reclining at the feet of Blanche Luttrell, while his cousin Jane Harrison, for whom there was some dim notion of his ripening into a husband by and by, sat looking on with an aggrieved air. "I took her a second cup just now," grumbled Fred, "and very nearly got my nose snapped off for my pains." Not an encouraging statement, but Mr. Forde was not afraid of any attacks upon his nose. Was not that feature in a manner sanctified by his profession, and the very high rate at which the curate race is held 250 miles from London? He was in no wise deterred by Mr. Melvin's plaint, but went off at once in quest of Elizabeth. "I sadden her with that melancholy story," he thought. "Perhaps I ought not to have told her. Yet I think she is the kind of woman a man might dare to choose out of all other women for his friend. I think she is of a different stuff from the rest of Hawleigh womankind. She has shown herself superior to them all in her power to win the love of the poor, and we could never be friends until she knew my story, and knew that the word love has been blotted from the book of my life." It was a new fancy of Mr. Forde's, this desire that there really should be friendship, something more than the everyday superficial acquaintance engendered by church decoration and croquet between himself and Elizabeth Luttrell. It was not to be in the slightest degree sentimental, the popular Platonic idea. The Madame Récamier and Chateaubriand kind of thing had never entered into his thoughts, nor did he mean that they should see any more of each other than they had done heretofore, only that there should be confidence and a trust between them instead of strangeness. He found her presently on her lonely bank by the Tabor, seated in a thoughtful attitude, and casting little turfs of moss and lady's slipper idly upon the tide. She had arrayed herself with a studied simplicity for this rustic gathering, perhaps fully conscious that she was one of the few women who can afford to dispense with frillings and puffings and ruchings, the whole framework of beauty, as it were. She wore a plain white muslin gown, high to the throat, round which she had tied a dark blue ribbon, the true Oxford blue, almost black against the ivory white of her neck. The long dark ribbon made a rippling line to the perfect waist, perfect in its exquisite proportion to the somewhat full and stately figure, the waist of a Juno rather than a sylph. Her head was uncovered, and the low sunlight lit up all the bronze tints in her dark brown hair, shone too in the luminous grey eyes, fixed dreamily upon the gleaming water. Mr. Forde stood for a few moments a little way off, admiring her, simply as he would have admired a picture, of course. His footsteps made a faint rustling among the rushes as he came nearer to her. She looked round suddenly, and all her face flushed crimson at the sight of him. That blush would have elevated Fred Melvin to the seventh heaven, but Malcolm Forde was no coxcomb, and did not attribute the heightened tint to any magical power of his own. She was nervous, perhaps, and he had startled her by his sudden approach, or she might be indeed, as her friends had suggested, a little out of temper, and annoyed at being tracked to her lair. " Don't be angry with me for disturbing your solitary musings, Miss Elizabeth," he said, very much detesting the ceremonial Miss. "But I really don't think you are enjoying your father's picnic quite so much as you ought, for your own satisfaction and that of your friends." " I hate picnics," she answered peevishly, " and if papa gives one next year I'll have nothing to do with it. I'm sure I wish I'd stayed in Hawleigh and gone to see my poor people. I should have been much happier sitting by Mrs. Jones's wash tub, or reading to Mrs. Brown while she mended her husband's stockings." "If you speak like that, I shall think I spoiled your pleasure by that egotistical talk in the boat." She only shook her head and looked away from him at a distant curve of the river. There was an awkward sensation of semi-strangulation in her throat. For her very life she could not have answered him. Yes, it was a bitter disappointment to discover that he had flung away his heart before he came to Hawleigh, that he was a kind of widower, and pledged never to marry again. " I am so sorry that I told you that story. Of course it was no fitting time. I was a brute not to have thought of that. But we so rarely have time for a confidential talk, and I have been so much interested in your work lately, so much pleased by your hearty manner of taking up a duty which I know did at first seem uncongenial to you, and I was anxious that we should be friends. Pray do not let the gloom of my past life weigh upon your spirits, even for an hour. It was a most ill-advised confession. Try to forget that it was ever made." Silence still, and the head turned obstinately toward the river. Was it temper, or compassion for another's woes more profound than he had dreamed of? " Say at least that you forgive me for having depressed you." Still no answer in words, but a hand stretched out towards his, a hand chill as death. " Let me take you back to your friends," he said, alarmed by the cold touch of that little hand, which he clasped for a moment with a friendly pressure, and then let fall. " I shall not forgive myself till I see you happy with the others." She rose slowly and took the arm which he offered her. That choking sensation had been conquered by this time, and she was able to answer him quite calmly. "Pray don't distress yourself about me," she said. "I am very glad you told me your story, that you think me worthy of your confidence." He took her back to the circle under the beeches. Cups and saucers were being gathered up. The bustle of preparation for departure had begun. Wagonette, omnibus, and dog-cart stood ready for the homeward journey, and the usual discussions and disputes as to the mode and manner of return were going on. Elderly spinsters languishing to travel on the roof of the omnibus, and protesting their affection for the perfume of cigars. Fastish young ladies pleading for the same privilege, and all the male kind, thinly disguising the leaven of selfishness that was in them, and the desire to appropriate the roof to their own accommodation, by an affected solicitude as to the hazard of cold catching. "We ought to have had a dance," grumbled Blanche. "It would have been the easiest thing in the world to bring a couple of men with a harp and a fiddle, but I suppose it would have been considered unclerical. It would have been so nice. We should have fancied ourselves fairies tripping lightly under the greenwood tree. I declare it seems quite a shame to go home so early, just when the air is pleasantest and all the stars are beginning to peep out of their nests in the sky, as if we were a children's tea party." The Fiat, however, had gone forth. The vehicles were ready, the fogyish element in the party eager to depart before dews began to fall, and toads, bats, owls, spiders, and other rustic horrors to pervade the scene. The juvenile population loath to go, yet eager for the excitement of the return journey, with all its opportunities for unlimited flirtation. Fred Melvin was the proud proprietor of the dog-cart, a conveyance usually appropriated to the uses of his father, the family carriage, in short, which, if it had only possessed one of those removable American oven tops popular in the rural districts, would have even done duty for a brougham. Urged thereto by his sister, and with considerable reluctance, the young solicitor entreated Mr. Forde, who had come on the box of the omnibus, to accept a seat in his chariot, a variety in the mode of return being esteemed a privilege by the picnickers. "Mr. Forde won't want to go back on the omnibus, I daresay, Fred," argued Laura Melvin. "You might as well offer him a seat in the dog-cart." To which suggestion Frederick growled that he wanted no parsons, and that he was going to ask one of the Luttrell girls. "You can ask one of the Miss Luttrells too, Fred. There'll only be you and me and Mr. Forde. Jenny's going home inside the omnibus. She has a touch of her neuralgia. I don't wonder, poor girl, you've been flirting so shamefully with Blanche Luttrell. I wonder how a girl hardly out of pinafores can go on so." So Fred went away to offer the vacant seats. First to Mr. Forde with reluctant politeness. "You don't like too much smoke, I daresay, and those fellows on the bus will be smoking like so many factory chimneys every inch of the way. You'd better have your quiet cigar in my trap." "You are very good. I don't like bad tobacco, certainly, and the odours I enjoyed coming were not by any means the perfumes of Arabia. But are you sure I shall not be in the way?" "Oh, you won't be in the way. I'm going to ask Lizzie Luttrell, and that'll make up the 4." Mr. Forde winced at this familiar mention of the damsel in whom he had permitted himself to become interested, but that kind of familiarity is a natural attribute of brothers in their intercourse with their sisters' friends. A different race, these provincial brothers, from the rest of mankind, Mr. Forde thought. "I'm going to ask her," repeated Frederick, as he tightened the chestnut mare's kicking strap, "but I don't suppose she'll come, unless her temper's undergone some improvement since I took her that cup of tea." Elizabeth Luttrell drew nigh at this moment, in grave converse with a little silver-headed gentleman, the ancient banker of Hawleigh. To Mr. Melvin's surprise, she accepted his offer with extreme graciousness. "I like a dog-cart above all things," she said, "especially if I may sit behind. I do so like the excitement of the sensation that one will be jerked off if the horse shies." But against this Fred protested vehemently. You must sit next to the driver," he said. "Laura can sit behind with Mr. Forde. Not that Bess ever shies, but you must have the post of honour." " Then I'll go home in the omnibus," said Lizzie. " I know riding behind always makes Laura nervous." Miss Melvin, pressed hard upon this point, acknowledged that the jerky sensation which was pleasant to Elizabeth's bolder spirit was eminently appalling to herself. So Elizabeth had her own way, and occupied the back seat of the dog-cart, with Mr. Forde by her side. The journey back to Hawleigh was a 10-mile drive through west country lanes, bordered by steep banks and tall tangled hedges that shut out the landscape, except for those privileged travellers on the roof of the omnibus. Only now and then did the dog-cart emerge from the shadow of hawthorn and woodbine, wild rose and wild apple, into the moonlit open country. But the odour of those leafy lanes was sweet, and beyond them, far away in the soft silver light, spread fair hillsides and wooded slopes, and brief flashes of the winding river. It only lasted an hour and a quarter, that homeward journey, the dog-cart keeping well ahead of the heavier vehicles, and Bess the mare performing the distance in so superior a manner as almost to justify that pride in her which was one of the chief articles of faith in the household code of the Melvins. Elizabeth would have thought better of the animal had she loitered a little on the way. Not often could she enjoy a moonlight tete-a-tete with Mr. Forde, for it mattered little that Fred interjected his trivial little remarks every now and then across Miss Luttrell's shoulder. Not often had he unbent to her as he unbent to-night, talking to her as if she were verily in some measure a part of his inner life, and not a mere accident in the outer world around him. That confession of his past sorrows seemed really to have brought them a little closer together, and Elizabeth began to think there might indeed be such a thing as friendship between them, friendship that would brighten the dull round of district visiting, sweeten all her life, and yet leave her free to dream her favourite daydream of a wealthy marriage in the days to come. A splendid position won suddenly by her beauty, a swift and easy translation to a land flowing with silks and laces and all kinds of Parisian millinery, a little heaven here below in the way of opera boxes and races and flower shows and morning concerts, while Mr. Forde remained at liberty to fulfil that scheme of a monkish life which he had in his own quiet manner avowed to his more familiar friends of the district visiting class. And perhaps some day, after I'm married, he will really go to the South Sea Islands or the centre of Africa as a missionary, she thought, with a little regretful sigh. And years afterwards, when I am middle-aged and his hair is growing grey, he will come back to England as Bishop of Tongataboo or some fearful place, and I shall hear him preach a charity sermon at a fashionable London church. It seemed hardly worth her while to be sorry about so remote a contingency, but she could not help feeling a pang at the thought that this part of her vision was the most likely to be realised, that whether the hypothetical baronet with 30,000 a year did or did not appear upon the narrow scene of her life, Malcolm Forde would spread his pinions and soar away to a wider field than this small provincial town. The dog-cart arrived at the gate of Hawleigh Vicarage quite half an hour in advance of the other vehicles. It was past 10 o'clock, and rare lights burned dimly in the upper casements of the houses that were scattered here and there along the high road on this side of the town, the more exclusive and suburban quarter, adorned by the trim Gothic lodges of the villas that half aspired to be country seats. The vicarage servants, and a sometimes nurse and general factotum, Susan the cook, Rebecca the housemaid, and Jakes the man of all work, were clustered at the gate, waiting to witness the return of the picnickers, as more sophisticated domestics might stand at gaze to see all the drags and waggonettes and hansom cabs of the famous Derby pilgrimage file slowly past Clapham Common. " You'll come in, won't you, Laura? " said Elizabeth, who did not wish her evening to close abruptly with brief farewells at the gate. Jakes can take care of your horse, Mr. Melvin. You'll wait for Papa, won't you, Mr. Forde, and to say good night to everyone? Well, if you're sure that you're not tired, and would be glad to get rid of us and go in and rest, said Mr. Forde doubtfully. I'm not in the least tired. I feel more in the humour to begin a picnic than I did at 1:00 today. Why, in London, fashionable people are only just beginning to go out to parties. We seem to cut off the best end of our lives in the country with our stupid humdrum habits. Don't you think the night is best, Mr. Forde? For study, I admit. Oh, for pleasure, for everything, cried Elizabeth impatiently. I feel another creature at night, out of doors, in summer moonlight like this. There's a kind of intoxication. One's soul seems to soar away into clear air, into dreamland. What would dancing be like at 11:00 in the morning, or at 3 on a sultry afternoon? Why, it would seem perfect lunacy. But at night, with open windows, and the moonlight outside, and the scent of the flowers blowing in from the garden, it is simply rapture, because we're not quite the same people, you see, towards midnight. For my own part, on a summer evening, I always feel as if I had wings. She said this in a rapid, excited tone, as if this particular moonlight had indeed produced an abnormal effect upon her spirits. They had all strolled into the garden, Frederick having reluctantly committed the mare to the man-of-all-work. Mr. Forde was walking between the two young ladies, Miss Melvin feeling that it was mere foolishness to hope for any attention from a curate, while Elizabeth ran on in that wild and almost disreputable way of hers, not in the least like a well-brought-up young lady. But then it was a well-known fact that the Luttrell girls had received only a desultory training, not the regular old-established boarding-school grinding, but sometimes a morning governess, and sometimes an interregnum of intermittent instruction from their father, sometimes masters for music and drawing, sometimes nothing at all. They were all clever girls, of course, said the genteel matrons of Hawleigh, or they could hardly have grown up as well as they had, but they had not enjoyed the advantages of an orthodox discipline for the youthful mind, and the consequences of this irregular education cropped up occasionally. The girls had read almost what they liked, and had stronger opinions than were becoming in vicars' daughters. To Laura Melvin's gratified surprise, Mr. Forde did not take any notice of Elizabeth's tirade about moonlight, but turned to her, Laura, and began to question her politely respecting her enjoyment of the day, while Fred, eager to snatch his opportunity, flew to Elizabeth. "Didn't Bess do the 10 miles well?" he asked by way of a lively beginning, quite prepared to have his advances ill received. But Elizabeth was still under the intoxication of the moonlight. She was a person of singularly variable spirits, and the sullen gloom that had come upon her after that interview in the boat had now changed to a reckless vivacity. "The drive was delightful," she said. "I should like to scamper all over Devonshire and Cornwall in such a dog-cart, with just such a horse, stopping at all manner of wild places, and being benighted and camping on the moors. What a mistake it is to live all one's life shut up between 4 walls in the same place, with no more variety from year's end to year's end than a fortnight in seaside lodgings. Oh, how I wish Providence had made me a gypsy or a Bedouin Arab." "Awfully jolly, I should think, the Bedouins," replied Fred doubtfully. "They tumble, don't they? I remember seeing some Bedouin tumblers at Vauxhall when I was a youngster, and was up in London with the paternal party. But those were all men and boys. I don't think the women tumbled, and their lives must have been uncommonly dull, shut up somewhere in London lodgings, while their husbands and brothers were performing, not being able to speak English, you know, poor creatures, or anything." "Oh, you stupid Fred," cried Elizabeth, who sometimes deigned to address the young man in this familiar way. "As if I meant performing Arabs. I should like to be the daughter of some Arab chief in the great desert, with my own darling horse to carry me on the wings of the wind, and only a tent to live in, and locusts and wild honey for my dinner, like John the Baptist. I should like to be one of those nice brown-faced girls who go about the country with a van-load of mats and brooms. There seems something respectable in brooms. They would hardly send me to prison as a rogue and vagabond. And how nice it must be never to stay very long in the same place. And to have no friends, and no home, and no books or piano, and to be of no particular use in the world, only always toiling more or less hopelessly for one's daily bread, and to die some day by the roadside of hard work and exposure to all kinds of weather," continued Mr. Forde, who had soon exhausted his little stock of civilities to Miss Melvin, and turned to listen to Elizabeth's random talk. " I'm afraid you must be very tired of us all, Miss Luttrell, when your soul yearns for the broom girl life." " Not so tired as you confess yourself to be of us, when you contemplate converting the heathen," answered the girl, turning her back upon the hapless Frederick. " It is not because I am tired of you that I think sometimes of a broader field and harder work," he answered gravely, " but for quite a different reason. Because I sometimes find my life here too easy, too pleasant. An enervating life, in short. It is not always wise for a man to trust himself to be happy." " I thought you had done with happiness after what you told me this afternoon," said Elizabeth, almost bitterly. Her speech shocked him a little, and he answered it in his coldest tones. " With one kind of happiness, yes, and that perhaps the only perfect happiness in this world — companionship with a perfect woman." " A very good way of reminding me that I'm an imperfect one," thought Elizabeth, not unconscious of deserving the implied rebuke. They walked slowly round the garden in the moonlight, side by side, but somewhat silent after this, leaving Frederick to straggle in their rear with his sister, an ignominious mode of treatment which he inwardly resented. Nor was he sorry when the omnibus and wagonette drove up to the gate to release him from this humiliating position. He felt himself rehabilitated in his own self-esteem when Blanche, who really came next to Elizabeth in the scale of prettiness, skipped gaily up to him, telling him that she'd had the dullest imaginable drive inside the omnibus, and that she'd been dreadfully jealous of Lizzie, who of course had been having capital fun in the dog-cart. " I don't know whether Forde is particularly good fun," Mr. Melvin replied with a sulky air. " Your sister had him all to herself. There was no getting in a word edgeways. I think when a man as good as gives out from the pulpit that he never means to marry, he ought to give up flirting into the bargain." " O Fred, how shameful of you to say such a thing ! As if Mr. Forde ever flirted." " I should like to know what he's doing now," grumbled Fred. " If that isn't the real thing, it's an uncommonly good imitation." Elizabeth had taken up her favourite position by the sundial, and Malcolm Forde was standing by her, talking earnestly, or at least with an appearance of earnestness. And it is one of the misfortunes of youth that two persons of opposite sex cannot converse for 10 minutes with any show of interest without raising suspicions of flirtations in the minds of the beholders. " Doesn't it seem absurd," exclaimed the aggrieved Frederick, " after all Elizabeth has said about never marrying a clergyman?" " She's not obliged to marry Mr. Forde because she talks to him for 5 minutes, is she, you stupid creature?" cried Blanche, disapproving this appearance of concern in her admirer. Eligible young men were so rare at Hawleigh. And now, after some consumption of claret cup or sherry and soda among the elders in the low candle-lit drawing-room, and a straggling flirtation among the juniors here and there about the garden, there came a general good night, and Mr. Luttrell's guests dispersed, in carriages or on foot, to that gentleman's supreme contentment. This kind of thing was one of the penalties that went along with a flock of daughters. " Thank heaven that's over," he said with a faint groan, and in a tone of voice strangely different from the friendly warmth of his last farewell. " And now mind, I am not to be bothered about any more party giving on this side of Christmas." I'm sure I shouldn't care if there were never to be another party on the face of the earth," said Elizabeth drearily. Whereby it might be supposed that, so far as the prettiest Miss Luttrell was concerned, the day's festivities had been a failure. Blanche questioned her by and by up in their tower chamber, the ancient octagon room, with its deep-set casements and litter of girlish trifles, its bird cages and bookshelves, and glove-boxes and scent-bottles, questioned her closely, but at the outset could extort very little from those firm, proud lips. " You know you were glad to have that ride home with him," said the girl persistently. " You know you quarrelled with him in the boat, and were miserable afterwards. You know you're fond of him, Lizzie. What's the good of trying to hide it from me?" " Fond of him !" cried Elizabeth passionately. " Fond of a man who scarcely ever says a civil word to me. Fond of a man who, if ever he were to care for me, and he never will, would want to make me a district visitor or female missionary. You ought to know me better, Blanche." " I know you are fond of him," the girl repeated resolutely. " Why, you've changed your very nature for his sake. As if we didn't all of us know the influence that has made you take up Gertrude's work." Elizabeth burst out laughing. " Perhaps I wanted to take the shine out of Gertrude's supernal virtues," she said. " Perhaps I wanted to show him that I was just as well able to do that kind of thing as his hoary saints, who call it their vocation ; that I was able to make the poor people love me, which very few of his saints can manage." " Upon my word, Lizzie, I'm afraid you're very wicked," exclaimed Blanche, staring at her sister with an awed look. Elizabeth was sitting on the edge of the low French bed, her brown hair falling round her like a sombre drapery, her eyes fixed with a dreamy look, a half mischievous, half triumphant smile upon her lips. " I'm afraid you're right," she said with a sudden burst of candour. " I feel intensely wicked at this moment. Can you guess what I should like to do, Blanche?" " Not I. You're the most unfathomable girl in creation." " I should like to bring that man to my feet, to make him as deeply in love with me as ever any miserable slavish woman was with a man who did not love her, and then spurn him. Fool him to the top of his bent, Blanche, and when I had become the very apple of his eye, perhaps while he was deliberating in his slow dull soul as to whether he should make an election between me and the conversion of the South Sea Islanders, astonish him some fine morning by announcing my engagement with somebody a little better worth marrying. He would have his South Sea Islanders left to console him." She flung the cloud of hair back from her face impatiently, with a bitter little laugh and a downward glance of the dark eyes, as if she did indeed see Malcolm Forde at her feet, and were scorning him. Blanche gazed at her with unmitigated horror. " Goodness gracious, Lizzie, what can put such dreadful ideas into your head? What has Malcolm Forde done to make you so savage?" " What has he done ? Oh, nothing, I suppose," half hysterically. " But I should like to punish him for all he's made me suffer to day." CHAPter 6.